Dr. Balkrishan Negi, on behalf of the Economics Department, Atma Ramsnathan Dharma College, under the aegis of Internal Quality Assurance Cell, welcome you all in this today's webinar on Indian economy pre and post COVID-19 issues and challenges. First of all, I would like to thank our dynamic principal, sir, because of his constant guidance and cooperation. We all are we are able to do all these kind of webinars, and uh, I would like to thank the convener, webinar committee, Dr. Vinita Tuli ma'am, and all the members of webinar committee, especially Mr. Ravinder Pantji. Because of his cooperation, we all are we are able to do all these virtual meetings. Thank you, Ravinder ji. And as we all know that because of pandemic 19, COVID-19 pandemic, all country across the globe is facing a kind of slowdown. In fact, India's slowdown, if I go back to the history, India's slowdown was started from 2017-18 onward, the fourth quarter of 2017-18 onward, because of the two policy initiative which is taken by the government. One is your demonetization, and second is GST. That the impact of this two, you can say a kind of policy which was the result was nothing, but we faced a kind of slowdown. And then after this COVID-19 pandemic, that this slowdown has aggravated more. And we have seen that result. The Indian economy slowdown in the first quarter of COVID-19 was highest among the developed. It was negative 23, almost 23.7%, which was highest among the developing world. And recently, now I'm going through the contemporary issues, the introductory remark that recently the government economic survey point out that India is facing a kind of, V-shaped growth, right? So on the contrary, V-shaped means initially that there was slowdown because of, COVID-19 pandemic led slowdown and all that. Now the things are getting normal, that Indian economy is getting in the path of, growth, the high growth, V-shaped kind of growth. On the contrary, if I point out that many of the mainstream economists, they are arguing that India's, the growth rate is not kind of V-shaped. This is a kind of K-shape, that the poor are becoming more poorer and rich are becoming more rich. And evidence is there from the Oxfam. That Oxfam is a reputed, NGO which is working on growth and poverty and all, in all over the world. So according to their report, they are saying that the 11 billionaire Indian billionaires, the generated revenue that is, that is equal to the 1 decade, the expenditure of the Manrega, government expenditure of Manrega and health. And then if we talk about the lower section, the poor section of the society, they will have it will take 10 decades to get the level of COVID-19. So this is what is a kind of, the K-shaped growth. So two argument is going on. One side, the government is claiming that the V-shaped growth is going on. And then the other side, the mainstream economists, some the critical reviews that Indian economy is facing a kind of K-shaped growth. If it is so, then I should quote the vast literature of the Nobel laureates Amrita Sen and Jean Drage, which is written in Uncertain Glory. They are talking about the Indian context, that India experienced a high growth rate during after the especially after the liberalization. But that if you see in case of the well-being of the society, that is that is much worse as compared to the Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal. That is poor. So in that context, the growth doesn't means that what we are doing with the growth that matters. We need to understand the dynamics of the growth. If the K-shaped kind of the growth is taking place, then we must be focused on the lower section of the society. And we have seen that during the COVID-19, who has affected much. Everybody, we know everybody is facing a kind of, problem because of the COVID-19 lockdown and slowdown and all that. But we need to think who have affected much and where we need to focus on. So being in academics, we have to see the different perspective of growth and what the dynamics of growth, and then we have to see what the government steps, the steps which is taken by the government is appropriately focusing on the growth as well as the distribution. The point is growth and distribution, not only the growth. If you see in case of the government's document, and if you listen to the government policymakers, they are only talking about the growth, but not the distribution. And we know that in case of the Indian economy, the country like ours, the developing economy, we must be focused on growth as well as the distribution. So keeping in mind all these issues, today we have with us to understand the roots of the cause of the concern. Today we have with us is young economists who have worked more on these the macroeconomic aspects and development aspects, especially during the COVID-19, what is happening in Indian economy. Today we have with us young economist Dr. Jiko Das Gupta and Dr. Ishan Anand. I welcome both of you in this webinar, and I invite the Dr. Saraswati Yadav. Please present a formal introduction of today's speaker. Madam Saraswati.
Thank you, sir. Good morning to one and all present here. It's great pleasure for me to introduce esteemed speaker of today's talk, who are going to enlighten us about the most important and very relevant topic of today's Indian economy pre and post COVID-19 issues and challenges. Definitely, this is a topic in which all we are very interested to know about the pandemic situation on Indian economy, because this pandemic COVID-19 is not just affect the Indian economy, but it affects everybody's life in different ways. Our first esteemed speaker is Dr. Ishan Anand, Assistant Professor at Jindal Global Law School. He is an alumni also of Delhi University. He did his master's from Hyderabad University in economics. He completed his MPhil and PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He is a recipient of a World Bank Robert S. McNamara Fellowship, and he was a visiting fellow of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His research interest area include agrarian studies, inequality, inclusion, labor, and political economy. He has many publications in reputed journals and edited volumes. Previously, he also taught at Ambedkar University, New Delhi. Our second esteemed speaker is Dr. Jiko Das Gupta, Assistant Professor at School of Art and Science in Azim Premji University. He completed his MPhil, PhD in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He also worked as research associate in Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi, and Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. His research has been published in various edited volumes and journals like Review of Keynesian Economics and EPWs. His research interest area is quite very large, which includes growth and distribution, monetary economics, public finance, international trade and finance, structural transformation, and political economy. He has number of research paper and working papers on his credit. Sir, I, Dr. Saraswati, warmly welcome to both of you on behalf of Economics Department of ARSD College. We are very glad to have you with us. Welcome you, sir. Now mic is over to Dr. Balkrishnan for carry forward this proceeding. Thank you.
Without wasting any time, I would like to invite Dr. Jiko Das Gupta to speak.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Negi. thanks a lot to the faculty member of Atmaram Sanatan Dharma College. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and share my thoughts. Let me share my screen first. Yeah. So how much time would I should stick to, Professor Negi? 25 minutes, half an hour, would that be fine? All right. Okay, good. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so
Yes, 25, fine.
25, all right. Okay, great. Okay. So as far as the Indian economy, the issues and challenges are concerned, I mean, given the intensity of the crisis, sometimes one wonders that, you know, what are the issues and what are the specific challenges to choose from a spectrum of issues and challenges. And as Professor Negi has rightly pointed out, some of those. And I will briefly try to talk about 2 or 3 specific issues of the Indian macroeconomy as a whole, and what are the challenges do we have right now given the unprecedented situation that we have. Now, the first and foremost stylized fact is, of course, pretty well known that Indian economy has been hit by an unprecedented economic shock, and you know, as would be well known that there would be hardly any occasion when different economists would agree on certain conclusions. But this is, I think, one of those rare occasions where economists from different streams or theoretical frameworks would agree that right now we are quite in a mess. The question, however, would revolve around the policy alternatives or the policy instruments and what needs to be done. And that what needs to be done would precisely depend on the analysis of the crisis itself, that what exactly is the nature of the crisis and what are the reasons for the crisis, and what are the available policy options to get out of the crisis. And what are the challenges do we have to implement such alternative policies, and what can be the alternatives? So these are the questions which I would briefly try to address. And now in this, throughout this framework, I would firstly would like to briefly talk about some of the existing challenges. And there are 3 specificity of the present crisis. The first is the timing of the pandemic. The pandemic hit the economy when it was witnessing the most prolonged slowdown during the liberalization period. And the table in the right-hand panel shows different episodes of slowdown during the liberalization period. The first column, which shows the episodes of slowdown, are the years in which the GDP growth rate was lower than the previous period. The second column gives us the number of years of slowdown. In other words, this gives us the number of years in which the GDP growth rate declined with respect to the previous year. The third column gives us the total number of quarters in which where the GDP growth rate declined on year-on-year basis. So this basically gives us how many total quarters the GDP growth rate declined during that specific episode of slowdown. And the fourth quarter gives us the total number of quarters in a year when growth slowed down for consecutive periods. Now, as you would see that the slowdown which started from 2017-18 onwards, as Professor Negi was pointed out, so this episode of slowdown was the most prolonged one in the history of liberalization period, when it comes to the number of years, the number of quarters, so on and so forth. And on top of this most prolonged slowdown, the Indian economy was, of course, hit by the crisis, the pandemic. Now, the second specificity of the present crisis is, of course, the intensity of the crisis, which again is unprecedented in the history of independent India. The projected GDP growth rate would be the biggest contraction since 1952. And the IIP growth rate, the average IIP growth rate, has been among the lowest as far as the G20 countries are concerned for India. And the right-hand side again gives us the bar diagram for the average IIP growth rate for different countries, G20 countries, between April and October of 2020. And as would be evident that India's, of course, contraction has been among the highest. The third is the distribution of the burden of the crisis. Now, as some of the studies in the works done by the faculty members of Asim Premji University have shown, including the works of Center for Sustainable Employment, have shown that the income growth rate of bottom deciles have been far lower than that of the top deciles during the pandemic. And this is, of course, based on the CMI database. And up till August 2020, the analysis was done. But what it points out is that not only is a massive contraction, but nonetheless, the burden of this contraction has been pretty asymmetric. And just in contrast, and this is a point which has been pointed out by the RBI as well, that despite sharp reduction in output and sales, corporate profits have registered a sharp rise during this period. And this is precisely due to more than proportionate fall in the expenditures or sales, more than proportionate fall in the expenditures with respect to sales. In other words, despite a sharp reduction in the sales or output, different corporate firms could register higher profits precisely because of sharp reduction in raw material prices, wages and salaries, and different components of expenditures fall in the expenditures. So essentially, there are three challenges which the Indian economy has been facing in the recent period. First is an unprecedented reduction in the output, and second is the distribution, sharp adverse redistribution of income away from the bottom deciles. And precisely because these two processes are analytically different, the policy measures required to address this would require not only the contractionary issues, but also the aspects of compensating income to the bottom deciles. In other words, there are twin challenges before the Indian economy. First is the recovery question, and second is the compensation question of the bottom deciles. Now, what are the broad measures that one can think about? Depending on which theoretical framework one chooses, one can broadly think about three routes. The first route is, of course, the route of loose monetary policy, and which would be basically, involve reduction in interest rates, very loose monetary policy in terms of liquidity injection, so on and so forth. Second would be, of course, fiscal policies, expansion into fiscal policy, but along with that, fiscal support as well. So that would be the second kind of a route. The third, and this has been one of the central assumptions of different mainstream economics, has been that of automatic recovery. That even if the government or the policy measures are, even if there is no monetary policy undertaken, even if there is no expansion in fiscal policies undertaken, there would be some spontaneous mechanisms within the system which will pull up the growth rate back to the initial position. And this third framework, which is a position of automatic adjustment mechanisms, has not been new. It's just that these frameworks have been questioned both on theoretical grounds, but as well as empirical grounds. Now, the second issue that I would like to touch upon is the broad, out of these three options, what has been the present policy discourse? And finally, I will come to the what are the alternatives or what can be done regarding the present set of challenges that we face. Now, let us first, so these are the, of course, two possible policy instruments which would be available to the government. Now, let us first think about the monetary policy. Now, it's of course, the RBI has implemented the loose monetary policy during the pandemic, but such a policy measure, of course, has not been new. Right since the 2011-12 onwards, the RBI has been implementing loose monetary policies involving reduction in the interest rates and liquidity injections. And this graph shows the trend in the repo rate, reverse repo rate, and the excess SLR. And I'll come to that. What does it mean? First of all, the three regimes that is shaded in the graph, what they basically say is that throughout the period, of course, the RBI has reduced its policy rate, which is the repo rate. But nonetheless, the three regimes are different in terms of the intensity of the fall in the repo rate. For example, the fall in the repo rate has been highest in regime 4. It has been moderate in regime 2, and lowest, the fall in repo rate, in regime 3. And we derive these regimes endogenously through a biparent methodology. And as one would see that throughout these three regimes, the repo rates or the reverse repo rates have also been falling, which is an indication of loose monetary policy on behalf of the government, attempting, the end objective of any loose monetary policy is recovery in credit and output. And what the excess SLR line shows is that how much the banks are investing in securities over and above what they are mandated to do. And excess SLR is normally regarded as an indication of the demand problem in the economy, precisely because the income which the banks can get by providing loans is much higher than the return that they get in investing in SLR securities. The fact that the banks are investing in such securities do indicate that lack of opportunities of credit demand in the economy. And this is precisely shown in the right-hand panel. The blue line gives us the credit flow of commercial banks, and the red line gives us the investment in government securities, all in flow variables. As one would see that these two graphs form a Caesar in the sense that they follow two opposite directions, indicating that whenever credit demand is low, the banks increase their investment in government securities. And what does it indicate is that despite a reduction in the repo rate or loose monetary policies, the RBI has not been able to reverse the trend in the output contraction. And this is, of course, true for the pandemic, as you would see that the 2020 period. But this trend is a continuation from the slowdown period of 2017-18, when the credit demand started declining. In short, monetary policy has been ineffective in bringing about a recovery, not only for the pandemic, but since 2017-18 itself. And this leads one to address the alternative instrument, which is the fisc. Now, as far as the fisc is concerned, of course, it's well known by now that 2020, the fiscal stimulus for India was again among the lowest in G20 countries, as far as the G20 countries. And one may note that since fiscal stimulus is measured in terms of as a ratio of GDP, precisely because GDP growth rate has registered highest contraction in India, there would be an upward bias for the fiscal stimulus GDP ratio. But despite that upward biasness, India would register a lower fiscal stimulus ratio as compared to its peers among G20 countries. But on top of that, the question is more than what has happened is about the policy direction at this juncture, which has been showed by the budget. And these are the broad trends of the budget 21-22 with respect to 2021. Now, there are 3 points which needs to be noted as far as this policy direction or the broad fiscal policy measures. First of all, budget 2021 has been characterized by a macroeconomic framework which aims at reduction in the borrowing or fiscal deficits. Now, expenditures by definition is a sum of the borrowing and the total revenues that the government would generate. Now, precisely because there has been a targeted reduction in the deficit, or the government aims to borrow less, which is basically reflected by the reduction in the targeted primary deficit ratio in 21-22 with respect to 2021, sharp reduction. Now, on top of that reduction in borrowing, there has been no significant rise in the revenue receipts, as you would see that the revenue receipts for the budget estimates is roughly the same as 2021. So the total borrowing, targeted borrowing has fallen, the revenues have not increased, and precisely because expenditures can be financed either by borrowing or by revenue. Now, since the borrowing and the revenue receipts together has been falling, this would imply a sharp reduction in the expenditures of the budget estimate expenditures itself. And this is precisely what we see as a reduction in the primary expenditure GDP ratio from 14% to 12%. And as far as the composition is concerned, as would be pretty evident, that the burden of this reduction in expenditures have fallen on the non-capital primary expenditures, which is this reduction. The right-hand panel tells us the exact component of primary expenditures, which would register a sharp fall in the next period, in the 21-22. And as you would see that different components of expenditures like rural development, agriculture and allied, fertilizer subsidies, health expenditures, all as a ratio of GDP would register a decline. But the sharpest decline would be in terms of the food subsidies. So what this basically indicate is that on one hand, there has been a target of reduced deficits or reducing the level of borrowing in the coming years, but also the inability to increase the revenue receipts. Now, if one look at that, why there has been no significant recovery in the revenue receipts, one reason is, of course, the continuation of the policy of low corporate tax regime. And this panel, this graph gives us the broad trend in the corporate tax GDP ratio in the present decade. As you would see that, right from 2011-12 onwards, with just a few exceptions of 2018-19 and 19-20, this would register a continuous decline. And of course, the sharpest decline, one sharp decline came about just before the emergence of the pandemic in 2019-20 itself, where the corporate tax ratio drastically declined. But it continued to decline even during the pandemic. And what the present policy discourse tells us, or the budget figures would tell us, that the government intends to continue this low corporate tax regime. And that is why there is very little or insignificant recovery as far as the corporate tax ratio is concerned for the 21-22 budget estimates. What this basically tells us, that the basic policy objective is to continue with this low corporate tax regime. So on one hand, the objective is to reduce the borrowing, and on the other hand, to maintain a low revenue receipts, and which of course would imply that the burden of this macroeconomic policy framework would fall upon the expenditure side, and which has been, as far the specific component of expenditures which has confronted that adjustment process has been subsidies and agricultural expenditures, non-capital primary expenditures at large. Professor Negi, can you just tell me how much time do I have? Just a quick check. You're muted, I guess.
Okay, you can take 6, 7, 8 minutes more.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Now, what does this two policy frameworks tells us? It tells us that A, monetary policies are not working. B, the government is simply not, of course, not relying on the fiscal policy measures for the recovery, either for the recovery or for the fiscal support. So there is no hardly any direction on that. So which leaves one with the alternative speculation that perhaps the only presumption which the policymakers would have is one of an automatic recovery. And the proposition of automatic recovery is not only theoretically problematic, precisely because what it basically presumes is that investments necessarily tend towards some equilibrium level of output and investments, and any shock is temporary in nature, and the economic system as a whole has an automatic adjustment mechanism to converge towards a full employment output or any targeted level of equilibrium output. And second, the India's growth experience would tell us that whenever India's growth rate has increased, it has been either due to higher global demand, which was the phase of the 2000s before the crisis, and to a certain extent between 2019 and 10-11 as well. And the second episodes where growth rate had increased was when, for 2-3 years, when the fiscal stimulus was implemented or fiscal deficits were jacked up. There has been, one can hardly argue of any automatic adjustment mechanisms as far as high growth regimes are concerned. And thirdly, even when one leaves aside the question of growth, the question of income support still lingers on, and which leads us to the final point, that what can be the alternative policies, or what are the constraints. The alternative policy, of course, has to embark on higher government expenditures in the form of fiscal support or capital expenditures to increase output growth rate. The only constraint what one can think about in this context is the stability of the debt GDP ratio. As far as the inflation is concerned, as even the World Bank right now has pointed out that inflation is not the primary concern or the constraint right now. And even for India, the inflation that the Indian economy is registering is of a cost push nature, which has been pointed out by RBI as well. So, if the only constraint is the debt GDP ratio, stabilization of debt GDP ratio, these are some of the calculations which we did in some of the working papers of Azim Premji University in terms of an alternative debt neutral fiscal strategy. I'm not going into the model. we don't have the time, but for those who are interested can take a look in our websites. What this basically tells us that we ask this simple question, that debt GDP ratio is a ratio between the debt and the output. The moment one increases government expenditures, even if the taxes remain unchanged and one increases the deficits, it's not that the output itself remains unaffected. The moment one increases government expenditures, output would also increase. To what extent it increases depends on the multiplier value. Now, using some of the multiplier values, which was estimated by RBI itself, what we argue is that what is required to maintain a stable debt GDP ratio for increasing non-capital primary expenditures is to simply increase the capital expenditures in a certain proportion. In other words, instead of a fiscal contraction, what is needed is an expansionary fiscal policy. This diagram simply tells us UG hat is the growth rate of non-capital primary expenditures and KG hat is the capital expenditure growth rate. It basically tells us that there is a positive relationship as far as Indian economy is concerned between these two kinds of expenditures as far as the objective of maintaining debt stability is concerned. Last but not the least, these are some of the alternative scenarios that we talked about, that even at given debt GDP ratio, one can finance much higher fiscal support than what we are doing right now. Final conclusion, that there has been a dual challenge of crisis of output and contraction along with adverse income distribution. The second, existing policy instruments and macroeconomic frameworks are not adequate for addressing the present crisis. And third, what one would require is some alternative fiscal strategy. And this alternative fiscal strategy itself might require changing the nature of growth regime that we have been acquainted with till now. Thanks. Thanks a lot for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zico. It was really a good and lecture. Thank you very much. One announcement, participants are requested to put your question in the chat box so that we can have the interaction session after the lecture by second speaker. Please put your question in the chat box related to the lecture and other many issues in Indian. So now I invite Dr. Ishan Anand. Please continue. Anand.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan, Dr. Saraswati, and all other faculty members of ARSD College. Thanks for having us here. And Dr. Zico Dasgupta has already given a macro picture. What I have decided to do is to go into some sectoral themes. And as Zico pointed out, it's hard to pick and choose 2 or 3 major challenges, right? But that is what I've tried to do. So we'll see. I have tried to summarize the challenges that I think are the most important, and the challenges that can be put in a broad umbrella. And of course, there are various issues. If we can go on disaggregating, and we'll find more and more issues. But in my opinion, if you will, if you ask me, what are the 3 major issues? So this is the approach that I have taken. I've just pointed out 3 major issues that the Indian economy is facing right now. And in my opinion, it can be clubbed into one, the livelihood crisis, which has, again, several dimensions. One, of course, you will all be aware of it, is the agrarian crisis, which for past, several decades, at least, past 3 decades, we have come to know of this particular term, agrarian crisis, where you associate the agrarian crisis with things like falling agricultural growth rates. You associate it with farmer suicides. You associate it with low agricultural incomes, demand for loan waivers, and so on. So there is one dimension of agrarian crisis. The related dimension is that of informality. So even though agriculture is in crisis, and we know all, we all know this fact that India has not had the kind of structural transformation that is expected normally. We have not gone that route, and our share in agriculture employment stays, it's close to 50%, whereas the GDP share is down to 15-16%. So there is a huge sectoral mismatch. Now, agricultural incomes are low. It is, and I'll go into the policy in a bit. But this unsustainable situation, as far as jobs and livelihood is concerned, what it has done is it has pushed people to look for alternative work. And given the fact that our growth in the last 3 decades has what is known as the elasticity of employment. Simply speaking, if your GDP grows by a certain proportion, is your employment also growing by a similar proportion? Or if the GDP is growing, is the employment growth inadequate, or is it? So that is the employment elasticity ratio, and we have seen that not only has, so you look at the last 5 years, 2000, and when I say last 5 years, last 5 years for which the data is available. So 2011-12 to 2017-18 or 2018-19. And this is the period for which we have data. We do not collect data on employment on an annual basis. We collect it on a 5-yearly basis. Now, if we look at this period, we'll find that the aggregate employment has actually fallen, right? So on the one hand, there is crisis in agriculture. On the other hand, the kind of growth that we have had, and before the slowdown, 2017, the economy was growing, and there was particularly a high growth phase between 2004 and 2012, right? So all this growth, unfortunately, has not been able to create adequate jobs. And not only has it not been able to create adequate jobs, the kind of jobs that are being created are largely informal in nature. Now, the agrarian crisis is pushing people away from agriculture to urban centers, to other rural informal jobs, all kinds of. So if you can, it's very easy. If you just look around on the way to, and just outside your homes, you'll find all kind of informal workers. One can find construction workers, one can find rickshaw pullers, one can find people who are selling, let's say, things like chole kulche in Delhi. Now, all these people belong to the large informal sector of India. And if you look at the pie chart next to it, 90% of India's workforce is informal, right? And this is in stark contrast to all other countries which imposed such a harsh lockdown. So, there are a number of countries which imposed a very strong, lockdown. Strong in the sense that, not much of a movement is allowed. And India is among the countries in which the lockdown was most stringent. This is a study done by Oxford University and others. Now, if you are imposing a very stringent lockdown, but your workforce is informal, what this means is they are not left with any, job security or social security, right? And that brings us to the question of unemployment. So, agrarian crisis, inadequate jobs, whatever jobs are there, much of it is being created in the informal sector. Other than that, there is also a huge rise in unemployment in the last few years. So there is some controversy around the data. I don't want to go into it, but if you look at the rise in unemployment between 2011-12 and 17-18, it has been phenomenal, right? So the last data point that is available will tell you that close to 6% of the Indian population is unemployed. Now one might ask, 6% is not a huge number, but first of all, we must remember that India has a huge workforce or huge labor force, in the sense that there are about 500 million people, that is 50 crore people, who are willing to work, right? Now, if you take out 6% of that, it is a huge number in itself. But if you go look into disaggregate data, you'll find that the burden of unemployment is borne disproportionately by certain groups and genders in the economy. So if you look at the women unemployment rate, it's far higher than the men's unemployment rate. So what does it tell us? It tells us that there are huge disparities, and I'll come to disparities in a moment. And then there is a question of wages, right? So on the one hand, there is a livelihood crisis, which, crisis of employment, crisis of what kind of employment and what do you get paid. Then there is a crisis of the social sector. Now, if we look at India's progression in terms of GDP growth rate, we'll find that India is currently, I think, 5th or 6th. There might be some changes after the pandemic, but broadly we are in the top 5, 6 in terms of the GDP. In terms of GDP, and before the slowdown, we used to boast about India being the fastest growing Asian economy, and we are trying to, or we are on our way to overtake China, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at the GDP or the GDP growth performance, and if you compare it to the social sector, there is a huge chasm and gap, right? And Dr. Balakrishna pointed it out during his speech. But if you look at any of these indicators, you look at health indicators, you look at nutrition indicators, education, social security, and just to give you a number, recently the NFHS survey was released. It's an official survey which measures what kind of nutrition do people have in a country. And we don't have the full data yet because of the pandemic. It was deferred. But this is the stunting data is for 2015. The last NFHS survey basically tells you 38% of India's children below the age of 5 were stunted. Stunted as in height for age. So there is a certain measurement that if you are a certain age, your height must be around this much, right? And if it is below a certain threshold, children are considered to be stunted. And stunting is a very serious issue because it is driven by factors such as long-term nutrition, sanitation, food. So if children are stunted, and 38%, as you can imagine, is a huge number, that means what kind of labor force or workforce are they going to grow into, right? And there are all kinds of morbidity and disease, and so it's a very serious issue. And you compare India's GDP, India is right at the top. You compare India's stunting numbers, you will find India is right at the bottom. Right? So it's a very strange kind of a situation where we are doing well in terms of what we are producing, but we are doing fairly poorly in terms of where we stand in terms of basic sort of indicators such as stunting. India can actually be clubbed along some sub-Saharan African countries in terms of stunting, right? And the third, and all these challenges are related. The third challenge is that of inequality, right? So why is it that we have this? Why is it that we are in this kind of a precarious situation where we have a very high GDP growth, or we have had good GDP growth, where we have very high levels of GDP, but on the other hand, you have you also have a persistent livelihood crisis and poor social sector indicators. Much of it can be attributed to inequality, right? And there are Oxfam numbers, there are Credit Suisse numbers. This is just one of the numbers. This shows you the share of top 1% in wealth. By going by the latest Oxfam numbers, it says 40%. So the top 1% of the Indian population owns 40% of country's wealth. There are some other reports, Credit Suisse, for instance, they'll give you a yet higher number. So these, in my opinion, are the are related and overlapping, but the most severe challenges that the Indian economy has been facing. Now, let me go into the agrarian crisis a bit, because that is in news for a long time, and students might be curious. Now, let's look at agriculture. Right now, agriculture again important for a variety of reasons. Not only employment but also India's food security depend upon it. Now, India, has been talking about doubling farmers' income. Right? You look at a lot of policy documents, visions, and speeches. You will come across the speech. What is the reality? Now, unfortunately, again, we don't really have latest data available. So this data comes with a lag. But you look at the returns that the farmers get per hectare. So if I'm a farmer, I'm cultivating 1 hectare of land, and much of India's farmers are small and marginal farmers, in the sense that they have very small holding, right? And they put in a lot of effort. Agriculture is not an easy job in that sense. It's backbreaking work. You put in a lot of effort, and then you get some returns. Now you look at all these 3 charts. These tell you how much return farmers are getting in real terms, in the sense that we are just adjusting it for inflation, right? We are deflating it with consumer price index. And for all the crops, there are ups and downs. That is, the nature of Indian agriculture. It's still largely dependent upon the monsoons. Now, even if you, so forget about the ups and downs, but what you are seeing here is today, or whenever the last data is available, 2017-18, the incomes that farmers were getting is lower than what they were getting 10 years ago, right? And this is, I've shown you for 6 crops. This is true for a whole lot of crops. So paddy, wheat, arrow, gram, groundnut, and soybean. But you look at any crop, this will broadly be the trend. Now, of course, there will be fluctuations. Now, this is an issue because on the one hand, we want we are claiming to be working towards doubling farmers' income. On the other hand, we have evidence which says that according to the latest data, the earnings of the farmer is lower than what it was 10 years ago, right? So this gives you a sense of the crisis in the farming community. Okay, now there is a whole lot of debate about minimum support price. Is it relevant? Now, many economists of the neoclassical persuasion will want minimum support prices to go. Right? Their argument will be that, look, minimum support prices are distortionary, they are not relevant, and government basically does not have any business in agriculture. Agriculture should be on its own. Now, along with that, there is another argument that you might have heard very often, that Bihar, APMCs are a problem, right? The agricultural, these are basically mandis, right? In Hindi, you call them Bajar Samitis. These are democratically elected mandis where, they take care of how the produce will be sold, right? Some states have it, some states do not have it. In some states, it functions well. And these basically, the legislations come from the state government laws, right? Or it used to, at least, before the farm laws were passed. So, the Bihar is a good example because Bihar got rid of its APMC, state act in 2006, right? And Punjab still has the APMC act. It has a lot of APMCs. Now, let me just show you for 2 major crops, how much, what is the difference between the price and the minimum support price. So, if I'm a farmer, I should at least be getting the minimum support price. Keep in mind, it's a floor price. It's the minimum that one should be getting. Whereas what you get in market might be completely different, right? It might be completely unrelated to the minimum support price. So these charts show you the deviation of price over MSP. How much more have I gotten over MSP for the last few years? Now you see in case of paddy, now the yellow line is for Punjab. I hope you can see the lines clearly at least. In Punjab, they have consistently gotten prices that are over. So this is percentage deviation, right? What percentage of price am I getting over and above the MSP? So in Bihar, in Punjab, you can see the yellow line is always above 0. What it means is year after year after year, the paddy farmers in Punjab are getting prices which is over the MSP. Now you look at Bihar, the red line, it is always below 0, right? What does it mean? It basically means year after year after year, farmers in Bihar, paddy farmers in Bihar, go to the market, but they do not get the minimum support price. They get a price which is far below. Likewise for wheat. So in wheat, the yellow line is almost equivalent to 0, which basically means that in Punjab, the wheat crop is sold at MSP, but in Bihar, again, the farmers are not getting the minimum support price. So what does it tell us? Now, in the context of the debate that we're having on farm laws, it tells us that just because we get rid of mandis does not mean that large corporations and private players will come in, they'll jump into the agricultural markets and start buying crops. Because if that was true, Bihar would be doing much better because it did away with APMC in 2006, right? So okay, moving ahead. Now we have seen 2 things about agriculture. One, the real agricultural incomes are low, and 2, private players cannot be relied upon, because if that was the solution, Bihar would be doing well. Other regions would be doing well, but that is not really the case. So then, the other route in agriculture is for the government to intervene. And governments world over put in a lot of effort in agriculture. They give a lot of subsidies, through various mechanisms. You look at advanced countries, direct cash transfers, you have all kind of income support. Now, when we look at India, we find that the investment in agriculture has been falling. And if you look at the public investment, which is not shown here, has been falling from the 80s. So we have a sector where half our population, in which half our population depends upon for their livelihood. That sector is in crisis. Incomes are not growing. Private players are not stepping in as is expected. And the player that was keeping, agriculture alive, so to speak, or, if agriculture in India was surviving, it was because of the kind of institutions we built. So India's Green Revolution, as you might know, was built upon a premise of continuous government support. That, okay, we'll give you credit, we'll provide you subsidies, we'll give you infrastructure, we'll give you, support prices, we'll give you mandis, but, you have to, work hard and feed us. That was Green Revolution, and that worked relatively well. It was inequality inducing, but, India's food grain output did increase. Now, post 90s, and in particular in recent years, the policy prescription is for the government to take a step back from agriculture. And you can see it in investment. Now, so that is the agriculture story. Now, very quickly jumping from the agriculture story to the story of the entire economy. Fine, agriculture is in a crisis. It's hardly growing. It grows at 3, 4, 2%, whereas the economy at its peak was growing at 8, 9 between 2012 and now. Is it the case that we at least have good jobs and incomes in other sectors? Now this table, okay, I'm not able to change it to person, but this tells you there are some earning slabs. Okay, what percentage of population earns below 5,000 rupees? What percentage of population earns over 1 lakh rupees? So this is what the simple slabs tells you. Now, unfortunately, this is a PDF and I cannot change here. This is stuck to mail. But if you were to look at the person, as in male and female together, you will find that around 60% of our population lives on less than 10,000 rupees a month. Okay, I'll repeat this number: 60% of the Indian workers get a wage or earning which is less than 10,000 rupees a month. Now, this number tells us that a large majority of Indians survive on really low wages, because if you're earning 10,000 a month, and then of course on the other hand you have things like rising education bill, rising health bill, right? You have situations like rising rent, right? So very dismal level of wages. Now, why I'm going into this is because we should be able to understand what was the impact of the lockdown, right? Now, when we announced the lockdown at a very short notice, at a 4-hour notice, and it continued for 3 months, India workforce is largely informal. The earnings are low, so no wonder people would run out of incomes and savings. And this reflects in the kind of humanitarian crisis that we had in form of the migrant worker crisis, where migrant workers were sort of they were left with very little, and they had to take the choice of either staying in cities and starving, or risking everything and walking for hundreds of kilometers to reach the safety of their homes. So this is as far as the informality and the agriculture issue is concerned. Now, what has been the response? Now, during the pandemic, there were some good interventions. For instance, increasing food grain allocation for PDS was a good intervention. There is no doubt about it. It saved the lives of a lot of people. On the other hand, for a very long time, economists, and particularly economists with a certain persuasion, have been arguing that we need to get rid of the PDS because there is a lot of leakages and there is corruption, and there is no denying that at local levels there might be some leakages here and there, but PDS ended up saving a lot of lives. But the free food grains, the extension was stopped after November, so it continued from April. There is a certain allocation that under the Food Security Act, the government is bound to give certain amount of food grains, 5 kgs per individual. Now that was increased to 10, right? But it was stopped after November. So whatever little measures were taken, 5 kgs of extra food grains, some 500 rupees of direct cash, some state governments took some extra measures for construction workers, 3,000 rupees somewhere, 1,000 rupees in UP, in Kerala, and so on and so forth. Once that was over, there was a range of new policies, right? And I will just focus on one, farm laws, because that is what we are talking about. But there were also many others, which included your code on wages. So there were wholesale changes in how, in how wages are determined, and what kind of regulations there will be. But let me just focus on the farm laws very quickly. There were 3 farm laws, and I'm not going to read out the names. It's quite a mouthful. You look at the first act. You can also call it the APMC Bypass Act, okay, because of what it tries to do. So what it tries to do is the following. It says that currently in many states there are APMCs. Farmers come to the APMC, they sell there. What this does is, and the state government can of course regulate the APMC. Why? Because it's an elected body. The state government collects taxes. They can use those taxes to make agricultural marketing infrastructure and so on. Now, what this new law does, the APMC Bypass Act, what it does is, it gives power to private players to buy beyond the mandis, where there will be no charges and no taxes. So the state government has absolutely no regulation. Now the central government can regulate that area, but till now there is no regulatory framework. So outside the mandi, where there was some regulation, right, in the form of state governments. I'm not saying the mandis were correct and they were sort of well-wishers of the farmers. There were of course problems, but now we have the farm laws have created a situation where people can sell outside the mandis, which will be cheaper because there will be no taxes and so on and so forth, but there is no regulation. So if a private player, and one can all correctly assume that private players, if they enter agriculture, they won't do so with a bleeding heart to help farmers. If they enter agriculture and agricultural market, they'll do so that they can make some profits. So if there is, in case there are some issues, and we know that there are power hierarchies, right, between what a farmer can negotiate and between what a big corporation can negotiate. Now, if there are some disputes, the law also states that you cannot go to civil courts. You have to go to the administration, the state administration. Right? Now, the second act says, I'll not go into the detail. Basically, it is saying you can go in for contract farming. There are some broad regulations. Again, the regulatory framework is not very robust. And again, there are concerns regarding dispute mechanism, in the sense that can you go to court? Now, the law says no. You can go to only the administration, right? The district administration, that is. And the third is the Essential Commodity Act, which was amended. Basically, what it used to do is, the government could control the prices of essential commodities. Right? Suppose the wheat price is going up, the dal, and you must be hearing about the onion prices soaring. I remember, a couple of years back, I think the onion prices soared so much that the Delhi government was, selling it for 29 rupees or so, and people were standing in lines in big bazaars at 6 o'clock in the morning so that the onions don't get over. Right? So, in times such as these, what happens is dal prices go up, rice prices go up. So the government could control it, right? Private players might want to hold the stock and wait for the prices to go up and create artificial scarcity. So suppose I have, and I'll give you an example, when this pandemic broke, in the United States, a news appeared that one person has filled his house with all kinds of masks and sanitizers, right? And what was his expectation was, let the prices go up, and then I'll release it one by one on Amazon and so on. Now, this happens at a large scale, or can potentially happen at a large scale, if there is no regulation. Now, what the government has done with this amendment is, they are saying, okay, these are not essential commodities anymore, and we will regulate only if it reaches a certain threshold. Right? So only if prices for certain commodities, horticulture commodities, for example, go up by 100%. Only then will we intervene. Now, what does 100% mean? If cauliflower is selling for 100 rupees this year, in the next year, if it is selling for 190 rupees, there will be no intervention, because it is not a 100% rise. But you can understand the magnitude of jump from 100 to 190, right? So you read all these 3 acts together, And some economists have pointed out that what it basically does, and you read it with falling investments in agriculture, and in particular falling public investment, what it basically means is that we are trying to pursue a policy of agricultural growth where the government now will take a back seat. So the whole, after Green Revolution, that trajectory will change, and we will more aggressively hand over the fate of our agricultural development, and by extension our agricultural and rural population, in the hands of private capital, assuming that there will be huge investments by private capital in agriculture, and ultimately the growth will trickle down. Right? So that is the assumption under which we have been operating for the past few years. And the argument, one argument is that all kinds of arguments have been given to justify the farm laws. One is that farmers are forced to sell to the APMCs, right? And because farmers are forced to sell into the mandis, they have no other choice. So what is wrong with giving them choice? Now you look at the numbers are not visible, but the red bars tells you the percentage of that crop sold in mandis. This is for 2013. Unfortunately, the last year for which data is available. Now paddy only about 15-18%. You look at all crops, very in no crop will you find that much of it is selling in mandis. So what is the point? The point is that crops are not selling in mandis because there aren't enough mandis available. So this argument that farmers are being forced to sell to mandis, and there will be a greater choice, is not based on any evidence. It is a misrepresentation. And the number of mandis actually have come down over the years. And there were commissions who said that we need more mandis, we need a lot of investment in agriculture. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Okay. Okay, I think just 2 more slides. Yeah, very quickly, let me just give you a few numbers and then I'll wrap up. You look at, in the midst of the lockdown, again, coming back to the livelihood and the social sector in particular, you look at, social distancing. So it was, if there is COVID, you have to have social distancing. There is no way to get rid of it. And that is why the lockdown. Now, about 25% of Indian population live in a house which has a single room. Right? Now, what kind of a social distancing can you have in a single room? Right? And about 65% of the population live in a house with 2 rooms. Right? And Indian households, we don't have many households which have only a single member. We have 3-member households, 4-member households, and I have all those numbers. I have not gone into it. But if your 65% of your population is living in a single or a 2-room house, it is very hard to maintain a strict COVID guideline. And which is why you see that in slums, the Sero surveys have showed that in slums, the antibodies, the percentage of population which have shown antibodies is much higher, in the sense that they have been exposed to COVID-19 a lot more than people staying in gated communities. Likewise, in urban areas, about 102 million people, that is 10 crore people, live on rented houses. So once the pandemic hit, because you are living in a rented house and you don't have any income, and whatever savings you have will be very low because of the levels of income that I showed you, you don't have much of a choice, right? And just the last slide. Okay, huge inequalities, layers of disadvantage, but the disadvantage in our country is borne disproportionately. And I'll just throw 2 more numbers. I know I've thrown a lot of numbers, just 2 more. If you look at the earnings gap in India, women on average earn only 63% of what men make. So if men earn 100 rupees in a month in India, women earn 63 rupees. You look at the caste-wise breakup, and these are all from official survey data, 2018-19. If an upper caste worker earns 100 rupees, in comparison to that 100 rupees, a scheduled caste worker will earn only 55 rupees. So just about half. So not only do we have high inequalities, we have precarious employment, we have an agrarian crisis. Unfortunately, the brunt of that is borne disproportionately by certain social groups and the gender groups, right? So high inequality, social insecurity, and the livelihoods crisis. One way to get over it would be, for a massive state intervention in terms of allocation. So I don't want to go into the budgetary numbers. We've already showed you, massive budgetary allocations, particularly in a time where people are, the level of crisis is, at its peak. One route would be that. The other route would be, what is the dominant policy route today, that you leave it to the private players and hope that they will invest and create more jobs and create more agricultural incomes. Unfortunately, the second route is being followed, but there is not enough evidence to show that any of it might work. Whereas there is adequate evidence to show that the first route, if you increase pensions, if you increase, if you implement minimum wages, if you, ensure some kind of wage parity, if you invest in agriculture, if you invest in urban housing, there is a lot of evidence from different countries to show that these policies might work. But it's a choice that we are taking, and time will tell. But it doesn't look very promising, the kind of policies we are pursuing now. I'll end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anand. You have covered all the issue which is related to the distribution, and this is what is I pointed out in the initial remark that growth is taking place, but we must focus on distribution also. And this slide is showing that we have a kind of structural problem related to growth and inequality. Both of you have, very lucidly and crisply covered the macroeconomic problems related to fiscal and monetary policy and where we need to focus more and what kind of policy government is adopting so far. And then the problem is something different, and the policy that is something making the contradiction. Keeping in mind the severity of 19 impact on the section of society. Although we all are facing the problem, but the problem, the impact is faced by the people who are engaged in informal sector, in agriculture, in small businesses and self-employment, mostly by nature, say that the informal sector and the people who are in unorganized sector, whether they are the farm business or the labor, they have impact highly. So the question is that the government should, focus on that area. Although the growth is taking place, but if the growth is kind of V-shaped, or not the V-shape, kind of K-shaped, then we must be focused on, growth and inequality also. But we have a kind of structural problem, and unemployment rate is rising, highest in the 40 years before the pandemic, 96.7%. Keeping in mind again, the issue is related to that unemployment is highest among the young. So thank you very much for highlighting all.
So whether we go into that direction in trying to ensure some of these at least, or whether we go into another direction of becoming a some $1 trillion economy, I'm hoping that once we reach that phase, then we will redistribute, because US has not been able to redistribute despite being 7 times our size. So I think it's, at the end of the day, it's a question of vision and policy choice that we have to make. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both of you. I think we have finished with all the questions. So even we are running out of time, so many time. So as being a convener, I have to present a formal, that vote of thanks. So my sincere thanks again to Principal Sir. Although he is engaged with some other work, so he could not join the meeting. So my sincere thanks to Principal Sir for his cooperation, and the convener, webinar team, Vinita Tudi ma'am, of course, and members, especially Ravinder ji, thank you very much. And secondly, my sincere thanks to both of you, Dr. Ziko Das Gupta and Dr. Ishan Anand, being engaged with many other academic and research activities, our duty is that you both gave me your consent to be the part of today's webinar, and it was really interesting and informative. I hope that everybody have got some idea of the issue related to the economy, macro as well as the micro level, which have covered. Thank you very much, both of you. And thirdly, I my sincere thanks to my respected senior colleagues and dear friends, my colleagues and student, especially that Ankit and Prerna, who who are helping me at the time when we are doing some kind of this activity. Thank you very much. And finally, I must thanks the most important and important of this webinar is the lovely participants. Without your participation, and this kind of webinars and activities would be meaningless. So thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thank you again, Dr.
Thanks.
Ziko and
Thanks a
Ishan.
lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.